Well, welcome everyone to this installment of the St. Kilian Adult Faith Formation Series, COVID edition. My name is Jonathan Goodwin, and I'm the Director of Adult Faith Formation at St. Kilian Parish. The celebration of Palm Sunday officially kicks off what Christians call Holy Week. We call this week Holy Week because holy means to be set apart. We as Christians set apart this week to remember the events that occurred during the final week of Jesus' life, beginning with Palm Sunday. In this video, we'll learn about Palm Sunday, explore the hidden meaning of Christ's actions on that day, and learn what Jesus really meant when he gave thanks at the Last Supper. Join me and enter into the mystery of Palm Sunday. The liturgy of Palm Sunday is a favorite of Catholics. It is a day when palm fronds are distributed to the participants before Mass, and the assembly welcomes the celebrant with joyful exuberance as he processes into the sanctuary. The palm fronds recollect the joyful welcome the crowds gave Jesus, laying out branches when he entered into Jerusalem that Sunday. The celebrant wears red on feasts remembering those who have died for the faith, and especially on Palm Sunday and Good Friday, because those are the days we recall Christ's passion and death. It's also a tradition on Palm Sunday to weave the palm fronds we are given into palm crosses, because the same crowds that welcome Jesus with branches from trees and cheers of Hosanna in the highest on Palm Sunday will later call out for his death, with angry chants of crucify him on Good Friday. This Sunday's liturgy is also unique in that there are two gospel readings rather than the typical one. Besides the Passion narrative, another gospel is read during the procession of the celebrant into the sanctuary. It is this reading which recalls Christ's entrance into Jerusalem, and the one we will focus on today. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, verses 1 through 11, say this about Christ's entry into Jerusalem. When they drew near Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find an ass tethered and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them here to me. And if anyone should say anything to you, reply, 'The Master has need of them.' Then he will send them at once." This happened so that what had been spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. "Say to daughter Zion, behold, your king comes to you, meek, and riding on an ass, and on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." The disciples went as did Jesus had ordered them. They brought the ass and the colt and laid their cloaks over them, and he sat upon them. The very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and strewed them on the road. The crowds preceding him and those following kept crying out and saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was shaken and asked, "Who is this?" And the crowds replied, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Like most of the events in the Gospel of Matthew, this account is jam-packed with many details we can ask questions about. But for this session, I'd like to ask three. Number one, why are there crowds in Jerusalem at this time? Number two, why do the crowds react the way they do, cutting down branches and processing into the city with him? Number three, why does Jesus enter the city on a Sunday? Question number one, why are there crowds in Jerusalem? The answer is that it was the week of the Feast of Passover. Passover was celebrated annually by the Jews, and it recalled the Passover event when God freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt nearly 1,500 years prior. Jews made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem each year to celebrate the Passover, and the reason they had to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem was that the Passover meal had to be celebrated with unleavened bread, wine, and a sacrificial lamb. But you couldn't just sacrifice a lamb anywhere. You had to do it in the temple in Jerusalem. Hence, Jews came from all parts of the Roman Empire for the feast. The city was packed with hundreds of thousands of the faithful getting ready for the Passover meal. But as important as the crowds were, what's more important is that it was the feast of Passover week itself. And this sets the stage for everything that Jesus will do that week. So now that we know why the crowds are there, this brings us to our second question. Why do the crowds react the way they do, cutting down branches and processing into the city with him? Well, to answer that, we need to look at another prophecy, Psalm 118. Psalm 118 is a famous psalm for a number of reasons. One reason is that Psalm 118 is a coronation psalm for a king, namely a king of Jerusalem descended from the line of David. Psalm 118 came to be associated as a prophecy of the coming of the Messiah king, a new son of David. That's why the crowd say, Hosanna to the son of David. Let's take a look at Psalm 118, this coronation psalm of the Messiah, for a moment. It says, Lord, grant salvation. In Hebrew, that's the word Hosanna, the same one we use in the Mass. Hosanna means give salvation or grant salvation or save. Lord, grant salvation. Lord, grant good fortune. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's the line quoted in the Gospel. The crowd say, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. They are seeing the fulfillment of Jesus coming into Jerusalem as a fulfillment of Psalm 118. And you should be familiar with this quote because this quote is used in the Mass. So what is the Messiah supposed to do next? Well, one rule when studying the Bible from a Catholic perspective is when you see something from the Old Testament quoted in the New Testament, don't just go back to the Old Testament and read those couple of verses. Go back and read not only the verses quoted, but the entire context to get the full meaning. So what is the Messiah supposed to do next? If we keep reading Psalm 118, it says, We bless you from the house of the Lord. The Lord is God and has enlightened us. Join in procession with leafy branches up to the horns of the altar. So this is the part of the psalm that explains the branches. The psalm talks about the people blessing the Messiah and joining him in a procession accompanied by leafy branches. This is why the crowds cut branches off the trees. They are paving the way for Christ's procession. And where do they expect the Messiah to process to? Well, the psalm says that the people will bless him from the house of the Lord. That term, house of the Lord, refers to the temple in Jerusalem. So the Messiah is supposed to process up to the temple. And where exactly in the temple is he going to? He's going up to the main sacrificial altar in the temple, or as the psalmist emphasizes, to the horns of the altar. Now, why would the Messiah king be going to an altar? Why not a throne? Well, the reason is that the Messiah is not simply a king. He's also a priest king, who will go up to the altar to do what? Well, what is a priest supposed to do on an altar? He offers sacrifice, of course, because that's the job of a priest, to offer sacrifice. Now, this is where the people are going to start to get confused because Jesus doesn't go up to the temple in Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice like the psalm seems to indicate. If you continue reading Matthew 21 after the account of his entry into Jerusalem, Jesus instead enters the outer temple area where there is no altar, and instead overturns the money changers' tables and drives the merchants selling the sacrificial offerings out of the temple with a whip of cords. This invokes the ire of the priests and scribes, and they begin to plot against Jesus, leading to his arrest and crucifixion. So at first glance, Jesus does not seem to fulfill the prophecy of Psalm 118. Wasn't he supposed to go up to the altar in the temple? And what is this strange reference to the horns of the altar? What are these horns? Well, according to the instructions given by God to Moses, the altar was to be built with 4 of what are called horns. It's uncertain what the horns exactly looked like. The horns have been rendered as looking like the horns of an animal or as spikes sticking straight out. And it was thought that it was on these spikes that sacrificial animal offerings were hung in order to drain their blood. So how does Jesus fulfill the psalm? He does not fulfill it by offering his sacrifice upon the horns of the altar in the temple. He fulfills it by offering a sacrifice upon the altar of the cross. And he's held up on that cross, held up by the horns, the spikes, the nails, which pierced his hands and feet. Jesus does indeed fulfill the psalm and goes up to the horns on the altar, but not in the way the crowds expect. And isn't that like God? We always expect him to do things according to our understanding, don't we? But that's not the end of the psalm. Now remember, Catholics, if we want to understand the Bible from a Catholic perspective, we need to keep reading. Because if you were going to offer a sacrifice in the temple, what kind of sacrifice would you offer? There were different kinds of sacrifices that were done in the temple. There were burnt offerings, cereal offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, guilt offerings, and all other subcategories of these. Which one would the Messiah offer? Well, the psalm concludes with this: "You are my God. I give you thanks. My God, I offer you praise. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever." The kind of offering that Psalm 118 describes the Messiah giving is thanks. Now, when we read this as 21st century readers, we tend to think of giving thanks to God as merely saying thank you to God, like in prayer. But if you were a first century Jew, the way you would formally offer thanks to God in worship was in the temple with a thanksgiving sacrifice, or what was known in Hebrew as a Todah. Now, the way you say thank you today in Hebrew is Todah. Try it right now. Say Todah. If you learn nothing else from this video, you'll have at least learned how to say thank you in Hebrew. But Todah in the first century did not merely refer to saying thank you by itself. Todah was the name of the thanksgiving sacrifice, a thanksgiving offering, giving thanks to God in union with a sacrificial offering. So if you wanted to offer thanks to God, you would bring a Todah offering to a priest and offer it up to God in the temple while giving thanks in the context of sacrifice. So the messianic figure in Psalm 118 isn't just simply going up to the altar in the temple and saying thank you. When you go up to an altar, you're going to offer sacrifice. The Messiah is going up and offering a Todah, a thanksgiving sacrifice. And why did one offer a Todah sacrifice to God? It was when one wanted to express thanks to God for a salvific action that he had performed in the worshiper's life. It might be offered by a farmer for an unexpected rain in the midst of a drought, or by someone saved from disease or some other affliction. And the Todah was unique because with other animal sacrifices, they would be either burned up entirely or given to the priest for consumption. But with the Todah, you would take your animal like a goat or a lamb, give it to the priest to be sacrificed in thanksgiving, but the priest would give the sacrifice back to you, and you would take it home and consume it with friends and family in joyful celebration, usually with bread and wine. And to complete the sacrifice, you had to consume the animal. You can see that talked about in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus 22 says, "And when you sacrifice a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord," that's a Todah, "you shall sacrifice it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten on the same day. You shall leave none of it until the morning. I am the Lord." Notice here God's emphasis on eating the sacrifice that day, with God reminding the Israelites that he is the Lord and he's commanding it. Psalm 118 is not just famous for being a prophecy of the Messiah. It's also famous because the entirety of Psalm 118 is a Todah psalm itself, used in Todah sacrifices. The very first verse of Psalm 118 expresses thanks. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good," and ends with the same verse. And in between those verses, the psalmist describes his triumphant victory over his adversaries. There are many psalms in the Psalter that are Todah psalms. When the Todah sacrifice was offered in the temple, it was accompanied by the singing of a Todah psalm, like Psalm 118. And Psalm 118 is important not just because it was a prophecy of the Messiah or that it was a Todah psalm. It's also important because it was a Passover psalm as well, sung at the conclusion of the Jewish Passover meal. In fact, the greatest Todah sacrifice of the Jews was the feast of Passover itself. The Passover was a memorial of the salvific action that God performed when he freed the Israelites in Egypt from slavery to Pharaoh. In celebrating the Passover, the Jews as a community would bring lambs to the temple for sacrifice and return to their homes to consume their lambs with unlimited bread and wine. So what is the hidden meaning of Christ's actions on Palm Sunday? He begins to fulfill a Passover psalm during Passover week. So how exactly does Christ fulfill this part of Psalm 118 during Passover week? When does he give a Todah sacrifice? Well, if you haven't figured it out by now, one more clue might be helpful. Because the first century Hebrew word Todah, the word that is used for the Thanksgiving sacrifice, is translated in Greek as Eucharisteo. It's where we get the word Eucharist from. Jesus begins this Todah sacrifice, this Eucharisteo, at the Passover meal on Thursday evening at the Last Supper. And you can see these Todah elements in the Last Supper Passover meal account in today's Passion narrative from Matthew when Jesus institutes the Eucharist. Matthew 26 says this: "The disciples did as Jesus had ordered and prepared the Passover. When it was evening, he reclined at table with the 12. Here we have the evening of the Passover meal. And while they were eating, Jesus took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and giving it to his disciples said, 'Take and eat, this is my body.' Then he took a cup and what? Gave thanks. In Greek, Eucharisteo. In Hebrew, Todah. And now you know that giving thanks is not simply a thank you, but a thanksgiving offering, a thanksgiving sacrifice. And this is important for us as Catholics because oftentimes our non-Catholic brothers and sisters will say that the Last Supper was not a sacrifice. And they will point to this very text, noting that our English translation says Christ gave thanks, like grace before meal. But Jesus was not celebrating the Last Supper with 21st century readers. He was celebrating with first century Jews who understood that giving thanks is not just simply saying thanks. It's a Eucharisteo. It's a Todah. It's a thanksgiving sacrifice. It's why the church, since the first century, has always affirmed this idea that the Eucharist is not simply a meal of remembrance. It is a sacrificial meal, a sacrificial offering, a Todah. Then he took a cup and gave Eucharisteo and gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which will be shed on behalf of many for the forgiveness of sins.'" Notice here, Jesus doesn't say, "This symbolizes my body." He says, "This is my body." And notice that what they drink from the cup doesn't symbolize his blood. It is his blood. Which is also why the Eucharist is a sacrifice, because the Todah required a sacrificial victim. What Jesus is giving them to eat is not merely bread and wine. It's the same body and blood that Christ will offer in sacrifice on the cross the next day. And finally, then after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Now the gospel doesn't say which hymn they sung, but guess which psalm is the last hymn of the Passover meal? You guessed it, Psalm 118, the one we just read, a Todah psalm. Because the Last Supper is not just a Passover meal, it's a Todah sacrifice as well. So Jesus starts his Todah sacrifice at the Last Supper when he gives thanks, continues it in his Passion, and concludes it at the end of Passover on Friday afternoon on the cross. The Last Supper and the cross are essential parts of one long day, one long Passover meal, one Todah sacrifice, and one giant fulfillment of Psalm 118. Now, if you look at this Passover meal, there seems to be a problem. You were supposed to eat the Passover with bread, wine, and a lamb. The last thing that seems to be missing in this Last Supper Passover meal is a lamb. We've got the bread, we've got the wine, but where is the lamb? Which brings us to our third and last question. Why does Jesus enter Jerusalem on Sunday? I mean, why not Saturday or Monday or Tuesday or some other day of the week? Well, to answer that, we need to look at the institution of the Passover feast itself. Here is the institution of the Passover in the book of Exodus. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "Tell all the congregation of Israel that on what day? The 10th day. The 10th day of this month, they shall take every man a lamb for a household. And you shall keep it until when? The 14th day. The 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs in the evening." So according to God's command, the Israelites selected a Passover lamb on the 10th day of the month and killed it on the 14th day of the month. So why does Jesus enter Jerusalem on Sunday? Jesus enters Jerusalem on the 10th day of the month of Nisan, which was a Sunday, and the crowds put him to death on the Passover, which starts on the 14th day, Thursday. And that's why Jesus enters in on a Sunday, the 10th day of the month. He's showing the crowds and all of us that he is the true Passover lamb. And notice what they do with the Passover lamb in the next verse. They take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat them. Notice that with the first Passover, the Israelites spread the blood of the lambs on the doorposts of the lintel of their houses. Jesus, the true Passover lamb, doesn't have his blood spread on doorposts. Rather, his blood is spread on the crossbeams of his cross. And notice, Catholics, at Passover, you didn't just kill the Passover lamb, you had to eat it. And just in case you missed that reference to eating, keep reading. They shall what? Eat the flesh that night, roasted with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall do what? Eat it. God repeats his command to eat the lamb, not once, not twice, but 3 times. I highlighted those references just to make sure you caught it. Because the work of redemption was not completed merely by the death of the true Passover lamb on the cross. It includes eating the true Passover lamb in the new Passover meal, which we do every Sunday in the Mass. Because, after all, the next Sunday after Palm Sunday is, of course, what? Easter Sunday. And what does the word Easter mean? It's the English word for Passover. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the mystery of Palm Sunday. We hope you enjoyed this session of our Adult Faith Formation Series COVID edition. If you like this video, please say Todah now by clicking that little thumbs up button on YouTube right about there. Or feel free to leave a question or comment. We at St. Kilian's Adult Faith Formation Ministry pray that you have a most holy week. God bless.